Hello, and welcome to the Monster Mechanics Podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me as always is the Scooby to my Scrappy, Zach Jaquays. Zach, what's today's episode?
I don't know. Why don't you tell me?
I have a pitch for you, which is that fantasy races need to not be just races. They need to be more different. I'm thinking fantasy species.
Okay.
A lot of people feel like they need to include elves and dwarves and halflings and gnomes and things like that in their worlds.
Sure. They're staples of fantasy.
Exactly. And they're a sort of a lingua franca for the fantasy world. But as time has gone on, I think that these all have drifted closer and closer together in the public consciousness, so that elves are just kind of a funny kind of human, and dwarves are a kind of funny kind of human, and
Sure.
halflings are short little humans. And why not just make them all human then? So my proposal is that elves and dwarves, halflings, gnomes, things like that need to be actually different species from one another.
Okay.
And therefore, you get real diversity in your world, where when you interact with an individual of one of these other species, you're not just talking to sort of a funny kind of human who has pointy ears or is really short or one of those things, but is wildly different from you. And that
Sure.
gives you a much greater breadth of characters that you can deal with and interesting conflicts.
Okay.
So let's talk elves.
All right.
Elves are, there's such a big mishmash now in fantasy worlds.
They are, and they tend to sort of have very similar features in that they are sort of the best kind of human, but with pointy ears.
Yes. And there are some tropes that they have, like usually they're more dexterous, but less hardy than humans.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're pulling Tolkien's elves, they're just better than humans in every way.
Mm-hmm. The Tolkien Ubermensch.
Really are, in a sad sort of way. Although, okay, side note, there's a theory going around on the internet that elves can see farther than the curvature of the earth because they are flat earthers. There's a line.
I love that.
There's a line in the Silmarillion about how they were created before the world was bent. And then somebody did the math on how far Legolas could see according to the map.
With his elf eyes.
With his elf eyes. And then somebody came to the conclusion that either he was seeing it as a flat world, or that he had like periscope eyes that were like 15 feet in the air. Okay, back to how do we make elves more different? They can't just be like humans, but better.
Okay.
So what's a feature of elves that we want to take and to make them more about? Like, is it that they're woodland inhabitants?
Typically, they are portrayed as sort of woodland inhabitants with kind of a very refined society.
Very refined society, very old.
You've got high elves and wood elves typically, and depending on what source you're appealing to.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, again, there's such a big mishmash that's almost hard to find out what it is that is at the core of being an elf.
Mm-hmm.
I think that most people would agree that elves are more in touch with nature than man. In fact, you typically see a spectrum where it's like men in the middle as sort of the ones who are both in touch with nature and mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And they put elves on one side and dwarves on the other.
Okay.
And I think that might be one of the most universal features of elves that I can think of. So let's take that. Elves are more in tune with the natural world than humans.
Mm-hmm.
If they're no longer a species with humans, they could have been a prey animal at some point in the past, or have aspects like a prey animal, which would be like they could have eyes on the side of their head, more out to the side.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to give elves antlers. I keep seeing it in World of Warcraft, and they did it. I think they did it in a couple of the Lord of the Rings movies too, where they just give them a crown that has antlers on it.
Oh, sure.
And it looks great. Let's just give them antlers. All right.
Are we talking like stag antlers, moose antlers?
If you're making a player character class, I think it's up to the player character. I think some diversity is fine.
Sure.
In fact, this is an interesting idea. If they're in touch with nature, maybe they're in touch specifically with plants.
Okay.
And maybe they have antlers, but they're branches or otherwise plant material. And so you have lots of different kinds of plants that could be growing out of the top of these guys' heads. But you might see in a certain season, various members of the elf society might start to bloom.
Oh, that's an interesting idea, yeah.
And have actual flowers growing out of these appendages off their heads.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. They might be kind of like a lot of antlered species where they drop off during certain seasons or during certain stages of life and then grow back in. that could be very visually appealing.
They provide a very interesting visual twist. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also signals very clearly that that's what these guys are about, is that they are in touch with the natural world, specifically maybe plant life. In that case, you might go so far as to make them vegetarians. They could be, hunters, and which would explain why they're so good.
Or why not give them photosynthesis?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so we have photosynthetic elves who are very much in touch with nature. I think that they're really often associated with bows too. So we might want to start to think about why that might be the case, why they might be such good archers. That's normally a hunting thing, which is why you would do that. So we have to kind of come up with why they'd be so good at it, but we can put that on the back burner. They are photosynthetic, which means they're not necessarily farmers either, because they can just sort of make their food. Okay. And if they're not farmers, they don't have a reason to settle down initially. They might be very nomadic because wherever they go, they're going to find food.
So one of the things that's also kind of traditionally an elf thing is they're very, very long-lived.
That is a perfect lineup with us just making them plants.
Sure. And what if as elves grow older, instead of currently when elves become older, say 1,000 years or so, they're still visually indistinguishable from the younger elves of their race. What if this sort of plant thing in the top of their head just sort of gradually takes over and they root after a certain age?
Okay.
And their civilization becomes kind of based around their elders, which are now rooted to the forest floor.
Okay. So we're imagining a world where elves and treants or ents are the same species.
Very possibly, yeah.
I think that works really well. That the longer you go as an elf, the longer they go on, the more plant-like they become, the less animal-like they become. And like a plant, if they're long-lived, they're sort of how caught up they are in the moment, how caught up they are in the now, sort of drifts away. They're more thinking about the 1,000-year picture than they are the day-to-day picture, and that makes it's a very alien way to think about things. They might even be sort of deity-like to their communities. I love that. That's really cool. And that gives them a reason to settle down, because once one of them roots and they don't want to abandon their loved one and still communicate with this, a font of knowledge that, it's 1,000 years worth of their knowledge and how to get around and skills and things like that they can learn from. So that's valuable. They wouldn't want to give that up.
So hunting might become less about not necessarily creating a food, but collecting fertilizer to fertilize their elders.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Or maybe it's the fact that, just as an aside, maybe it's something about the wood. Like a bow is a piece of usually ash. The best bows, or at least in European bow making that I know, it's a piece of ash that you've carved in a very particular way to make it to be very strong and flexible. And it's carved, and it takes a lot of. It's not even a scientific thing. You can't make a template and then make bows with it. You have to kind of custom craft each of them, which I can imagine something that is part plant itself and is very much in tune with trees and the wood. That might just make them good at that. That is something they are really good at making. So you could come in from that angle where they don't even need to hunt really. They just really enjoy archery, and they have a long time to get good at it, and so they become very good at it. In fact, you could see almost an nth stage elf, one that's been around a long time but hasn't rooted, where it's just grown its arm, its fingers out or something like that, where it's become a bow.
Yeah.
And it has just strung some catgut or whatever or sinew, and it just uses that. It's got a bow built in all of the time, which I like.
Be an interesting evolution.
And if they're in touch with nature, maybe they have a sort of innate ability to modify and build out of living plant. Have you seen where people will take trees as saplings and form them?
Sure.
So you can imagine that might be the way their cities look. Is they never chop something down and then reform it with saws and things like that. Instead, because they have the time, they plant a tree there and they form it over time to become what they need it to be, where they need it to be.
Because they have the time and patience to do that.
and the sort of intuit knowledge of, okay, well, this is how a plant will work, and I can do this, and this will keep it alive, and I know if I do that, like making them very in tune with that part of their world makes them very different from how humans approach things.
Sure, I'm sure they're aghast at human carpentry practices.
Absolutely. And it might even not be a thing of like, oh, that's barbaric, but they might be like, why are you going through so much trouble? All you have to do is this thing that you couldn't possibly do in the time that you have.
Yeah. Just wait 100, 120 years and
it doesn't take that long, and it'll last forever because, we've built a wall out of trees. I like that a lot. Yeah, I think that actually would tie together the elves, ents, and dryads kind of all together.
Sure.
The concept of the dryad, which is like a woman who lives inside of a tree, you could just rope that in and say, well, that's kind of coming from this idea of the elves who are in tune with their elders and like talking about their mother tree. Well, no, that literally is their mom, like who just rooted a few thousand years back and is still there. I like that. And that gives you an opportunity to make elves who are very alien, because they're going to think on a much different time scale than humans. This also gives the idea that they might be photosynthetic, gives some credence to the idea of them climbing trees all the time just to get above the canopy in order to get the couple of hours a day that they need to stay in the sun.
Sure.
In fact, one of the things I've seen occasionally is that elves don't sleep. That's something that a lot of different authors have pulled. That might be because they spend some time photosynthesizing instead, where instead of having to lay their head down for 8 hours a day, instead they have to get out in the sunlight and stay very still for a few hours a day in order to get their nutrients.
That'd be interesting. It might even lend to making elves sort of a nocturnally active
That was exactly the thing I was thinking. Yeah, that if you have to be sedentary during the day, you might be conscious and like able to speak, but you can't move. You're stuck at night, or you're stuck during the day. At night, that's when you get all your shit done.
Yeah, and that might even kind of tie back into elves are traditionally thought to have better eyesight than other species. If their eyesight is seeing at night, well, there you go.
Absolutely. That makes something that always seems sort of tacked on just because they're better than humans, now more integral to their whole milieu.
Sure.
Very on theme for them.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. Well, I think we've made sufficiently alien elves. They're going to be half plant creatures that can't even see the short term.
Sure.
I like that a lot. And they're going to have this, entirely plant-based society with centering around their ancient elders. I think that's sufficiently weird. Okay, let's talk dwarves.
Okay.
So again, they've been so mishmashed that it's almost hard to find their initial the core of dwarfdom. The earliest version of the modern dwarf that I can think of is the ones from Norse mythology. There isn't a whole lot there. They are mostly associated with the construction of fine things.
Yes.
Which I think has mostly kept through. I'm having a hard time thinking of any fantasy dwarf that doesn't make cool stuff.
Yeah, that has sort of been the unifying theme throughout all dwarves is they're excellent craftsmen.
So excellent craftsmen. I think we might want to go with cave dwelling or something along those lines, subterranean, or at least highly associated with the earth and rock, things like that. Just to give them one other aspect. We have, nature and trees was where we went with the elves.
Sure.
So let's go with stone and rock. They need to be really different. They can't just be mechanists like humans.
Sure.
I think they might be living rocks.
Okay.
This is something that Pratchett did really well with his trolls. But I think it would be more thematically fitting with dwarves.
Okay.
They would be very, very stone-like. And you could see them even, if your hands are made of a resilient, semi-flexible stone, you could craft things with your bare hands.
Sure.
Like you don't even need tools to work metal. You can grab a red-hot iron ingot and shove it onto an anvil and just pound it out and work it like clay.
Interesting.
Because you've got heat-resistant hands, so you can just work it.
Sure.
And because that's something that they were able to do, for all of their history, they didn't have to wait to develop tools in order to start working these materials. It's not even something they might not even be proud of. It's just something they take for granted.
Sure.
They might go, yeah, we all do that. That is what it means to be a dwarf. But we're not proud of breathing.
Yeah.
Or I love the idea of a little child dwarf messing with like gold and just like braiding it the way that other children braid friendship bracelets.
Oh, yeah. I do like the idea of dwarves as sort of living stone, but I also like the idea that if they're underground, that maybe they're also blind.
That is something that a lot of fantasy worlds drop
Mhm.
for reasons that I don't understand. Like blind is such a universal thing about subterranean species.
Mhm.
I think it makes perfect sense for dwarves.
Like with that in mind, like craftsmanship becomes more of a tactile thing rather
It's
than.
literally working with your hands
Mhm.
and feeling it with your fingers.
And so their appreciation of, fine craftsmanship would be more based on touch than how it looks. So dwarven craftsmanship could actually start to become very alien looking.
Oh, yeah, it would be about the textures of things
Hmm.
and sort of emphasis on the edges, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if they're all blind, they're going to what they emphasize is going to be very different. It's going to be
Mhm.
all about the texture and the form of something. And
Absolutely.
for example, they won't care about color at all.
Hmm.
In fact, it might either be completely grayscale or natural material colors,
Hmm.
or maybe it's garish. Like
Yeah.
they might not differentiate between different colors of stones.
Hmm.
And to a human, it might look like they're disregarding something that's really important, but for them, it doesn't matter at all.
Hmm.
And they might, again, they'll probably live in complete darkness.
Hmm.
So if they're blind, what is their primary sense then? Hearing?
Well, I have to imagine like underground, like touch is probably very important to
Mhm.
them. Sound, like probably normal.
Yeah. Based on my memory of cave species,
Hmm.
they do have pretty good hearing because caves are not particularly loud environments.
Hmm.
And so they have very sensitive hearing,
Sure.
which means that loud noises will probably be painful to a species like this, like our version of the dwarves.
Well,
'Cause
and if they're constantly forging and
Yeah.
or whatnot,
they may be inured to it.
yeah.
Some RPG settings give dwarves some version of like an earth sense,
Hmm.
where just by being in contact with the ground, they get some sense of the world around them.
Hmm.
And for a species that is living rock or living stone, I think that would make sense. I think that works well.
Like I almost like the idea that they're both blind and deaf, like and like they live through almost an entirely alien set of senses.
I am all for making them as weird as possible. So
Sure.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a world where their main. I think that you might want to still give them something like smell.
Hmm.
Or there might not be any difference between touching something with their fingers and touching something with their tongue, the way
Hmm.
we have, where they get all of their senses go through this sense of touch.
Hmm.
And when they put their hand on a piece of marble, they get not just its texture and the relative temperature, but they also start to sort of smell and taste it as well.
Hmm.
So that they can go, oh, yeah, there's some, silicon in this. There's some impurities in this rock. And I know that because I've touched rocks my whole life.
Hmm.
And I have a very clear sense. Also means that shaking hands with a dwarf means that they're going to know what you were just touching. It also makes communication with them much harder.
Sure.
Because they're not even going to get sign language and they're not going to get vocal speech.
Hmm.
Um,
I do like the idea of like going back to that thing of like if a dwarf is made of stone and whatnot,
Mhm.
what happens if it's like fragmented or chiseled? Like, what if it's still able to sense through the part of it that's been removed?
That is pretty cool. Especially if you're imagining these as sort of they come into the world fully formed
Mhm.
and stay that way. I think if
Maybe they hatch from geodes.
they're a creature that grows from a child state,
Mhm.
then they're just biological enough that maybe that doesn't make as much thematic sense.
Okay.
But certainly if they were, I mean, you can almost imagine a jealous earth god
Mhm.
looking at man and saying, well, I wish I'd created something as cool as that.
Yeah.
And just making the rocks into a man
Mhm.
and instead having created dwarfs.
What if they start off like as just sort of a rough form, and either the dwarf's parents or the dwarf itself forges or crafts itself over time, and so you end up with wildly visually looking different dwarves as each one sort of defines itself.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. Well, we might leave the origin of when a new dwarf is made as a little bit vague at the moment.
Sure.
But I love the idea that you start with X, a version of them, sort of a lumpy clay for, like the child first sculpture version of a
Yeah.
creature. And yeah, they get crafted over time. That's really cool. You could have very small ones for that like doing small, delicate tasks. And then you might have the dwarf, quote unquote, that is several stories tall. That is about, his job is mostly to move things about and operate really heavy machinery and stuff like that. And they're this society that, I don't think working on yourself is going to be a very easy thing for a creature to do, just from the angles. And also, like, you don't have as much of a good sense of yourself. So they're going to be very reliant on each other. And that task of going in and refining your own shape or changing your shape might be their version of like communal grooming in other species, where that's how they socialize. That's how they...
The dwarven barbershop, as it were.
I was thinking more about like the way a lot of monkeys will spend a lot of their time grooming each other as a way to build their social bonds. And so, this is the exact same thing. This is like you ask the most trusted person you know to make the changes to you, and they would do in reverse. And that's how you reaffirm your social bonds. And
I like that.
Yeah, and they would and because of that, they might have these very tight troop-like cultures where everybody knows everybody really well because they all work on each other. And if any one person was exiled, they no longer are able to take care of themselves. And that they might literally break down over time. Like you're talking about fracturing or cracking. Yeah. Maybe that's one of the things they do frequently is repair those little micro fractures and rebuild the worn down parts of each other so that if one of them was to leave, it is literally a death sentence.
I like that. Maybe the idea of like killing or destroying a dwarf isn't something that's considered, but exiling is basically the same thing to them.
Yeah, they wouldn't. The idea of them breaking one of their kind wouldn't even like they're like, no, that's just not.
No, I worked on that. I'm not going to break that.
Yeah, no, like that's just not what we do. But we can't keep you in the society, so we're going to kick you out. And if you don't find somewhere else to live and people to take care of you, then your time is numbered. That's really cool. Okay, those are sufficiently alien dwarves, I think. Then.
Yeah, I think we've covered that pretty nicely.
I think we have to tackle these next two as a pair, because halflings and gnomes, every time I see these in fantasy, they're basically the same creature.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case of late, that there's very little to differentiate the two. They're both short.
They have a lot of the same sort of, especially D&D halflings, have that kind of mischievous nature that gets pulled in from some places that wasn't part of Tolkien's vision for them, but is definitely a very gnomish thing as well. So we really want to differentiate these two. Let's tackle halflings first.
Sure.
This is one of the few creatures we're going to talk about that has a canonical origin, because everybody is pulling off of Tolkien, and Tolkien seems to have made up hobbits, trademark, seems to have made up hobbits kind of out of whole cloth. And he was doing it specifically to evoke the pastoral farmers of England. And that was kind of their thing. That was they had their own craftsmen. They had their own small little lives that they liked by themselves. They lived underground and grew very good crops. And that was kind of their thing. And to Tolkien's credit, halflings were a kind of man in his world.
Yes.
They're one of the few things on this list that was actually listed as a kind of man. So maybe they wouldn't have to be all that different, but let's make them different.
Sure, why not?
Just for the heck of it. Why would they be so small? I think we could pull in the fact that they live in burrows.
Okay.
Because the smaller you are, the less you have to excavate for a burrow. So they're underground houses, maybe how they've been living for most of their development, which would explain...
Mole people.
Okay, well then we're going to go with naked mole rats even.
Oh no.
If you want to make hobbits naked mole rat people, then they're going to be hairless. They're going to be blind. They're going to be apparently immune to cancer and be able to survive in incredibly low oxygen environments, which is what their hovels are. They're also the closest thing that mammals have to like a termite colony. They have a single female that does all of the birthing, and all of the rest of them kind of act like drones.
Interesting.
Now, that's a really weird way to take hobbits.
That is a really weird way to take hobbits. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that before I derail this. Derail
away.
No, I like the idea that maybe the reason hobbits are living in these burrows or dens is because that's what they were most equipped to create for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they've got large digging claws and star-shaped noses.
Actually, that keeps them away from our version of dwarves too, which are all about working in stone.
Mm-hmm.
They're about dirt. That's their thing. And so having those big shovel claws to work the land, and that leads them to a proclivity towards farming too, because it's like half the effort for them to till soil than it would be for a human to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. Yeah, if they're burrowing animals, they'll probably have pretty good low light vision as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be burly little stocky guys too.
Oh yeah.
And that might explain the big feet a little bit.
Sure.
Because like human hands are one of our sense organs in a lot of ways. There is so many nerves inside of our hands. And there are a similar number in our feet as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a creature that is very interested in the nature of the soil around you, because that is the world you live in and the place from which all of your food grows, they might be consciously keeping themselves barefoot so that they can get all of that information. Stepping through the soil and digging their toes into the dirt might be a way for them to get lots of information about what's going on in that soil and dirt. Know how much they could dig, know if there's any worms, know if there's what the soil content was. I like that. That makes a feature of halflings and hobbits, the sort of barefootedness of them, part of them instead of just being they've got big hairy feet.
Yeah.
And also because if they've got big shovel-like digging hands, those might be comparatively less sensitive.
That would make sense, yeah.
Going off of that, handshaking with giant shovel hand claws is probably not a very good greeting.
No, probably not.
They might press the soles of their feet together.
An interesting idea.
That might be the closest analog to
I
them.
also like that if they're like kind of a developed society, that if they still need to manipulate things, like maybe they have prehensile feet.
Oh, little hand feet.
Yes.
I love it. And like long toes that are like fingers.
And like when they're trying to interact with things, they're standing on their hands and manipulating things with their feet.
Oh, that's so weird. I love it. Yeah. Okay. So they have these big, heavily muscled arms that are longer than a normal person's arms.
Sure. Yeah.
Than a human's arms. So that they are actually
proportionally, anyways.
Yeah, proportionally. And they might move in a sort of gorilla type gait where they're pushing, they're resting themselves on their hands through part of it. And maybe they have the ability to even walk on their hands or on their legs if they need to, but that they're most comfortable doing that sort of four-legged.
Yeah, that kind of lope.
Yeah, that lope. And then, whenever they need to actually do something, if they need to do something heavy, like pick up something big, they use their big, heavy claw hands. They dig with those, and that's how they get the tubers and roots and stuff out of the ground, and that's how they work the soil.
I like it.
Excavate things. And then for fine work, like even eating probably, like getting food into your own mouth, you like stand up on your arms and your little hand feet come out and do all of the work. That is so cool.
I like it.
Yeah, I like it. That's as weird as it needs to get. That's so beautiful. I love this version of I kind of historically hate halflings, and this is a version of it that I am really interested in.
Excellent.
That's so good. Okay, so then what do we do with gnomes?
Okay, well, gnomes are often seen as traditionally fey creatures, correct?
Yeah, they're it's just another word for like there's a really common folk legend of like the little people that live around you. And it seems to be really old with humanity because we've got lots and lots of different names for them and lots of different very similar legends.
Sure.
And so gnomes is just a word for that. So you can either pull back to that or you can kind of take it in your own direction, whichever feels good for you.
Well, I do like the idea that gnomes are kind of maybe sort of a trickster spirit or creature. And I like the idea that that kind of manifests as just like this, like a very tiny creature, even smaller than they're typically portrayed. Like,
make them real small.
Yeah, like, or maybe their sizes range. Like they could be anywhere from like child-sized to mouse-sized or smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe not even it's not even like there's different kinds of gnomes and some of them are big and some of them are small in terms of like, there's not races of gnomes.
Sure.
But that two regular sized gnomes might have a tiny little child or like the child-sized gnome and the mouse-sized gnome might totally be married and that's just normal for them.
Yeah.
That's just totally fine. I'm going to pull in the Knack Mac Feegle from Terry Pratchett's books.
Okay.
They are naked mole rats from earlier. They're a colony structure where they're all small and they have one female that does all of the birthing. They're all just one big family. They're all related to one another. Where they're these little tiny guys, but they have some sort of amount of dimorphism too. Yeah, the idea of pulling on their illusion and tricksterness is pretty cool. Some versions, like some RPGs, give them like illusion powers kind of natively. maybe that has to do with, I know that a lot of the times the easiest illusion is to sort of create lights.
Mhm.
You might approach them as they're one of the Will-o'-the-Wisp origin stories.
Interesting.
Like they make these little lights for some sort of reason, and that's what people see in the forests.
Our gnomes are bioluminescent.
Well, I was thinking they were making them out of magic, but yeah, we could totally do bioluminescent gnomes. Yeah, no, screw it. Let's do that. Okay, so we've got
They
bioluminescent
have
gnomes.
bioluminescent spores.
Okay, so bioluminescence is often used as a sort of lure
Hmm.
for prey animals.
Okay.
That if you're in a dark environment, the other option is like fireflies, where it's a way of signaling to your own species, like where you are and who you are, which sounds interesting to you.
Well, I think we've already kind of touched on the bioluminescence as a lure
Yeah.
with our mermaids episode.
Yes. Okay, so then let's go with they flash lights to talk to one another then.
All right.
Fireflies traditionally do this for mating purposes. They make their butts glow so that other fireflies will be like, ooh, look at that sexy glowing butt. But I think that a sentient species, I think that might be their primary form of communication.
Oh, I like that. So they basically have built-in fiber optic communication.
Absolutely. And, okay. So they're tricksters, right?
Yeah.
So let's give them the sort of color changing abilities of cephalopods.
Okay.
A lot of squid and a lot of octopides. If ever you're going to say the plural of octopus, remember how much fun it is to say octopodes.
Octopides. All right.
Okay, so if you're going to go for
the first for me.
But a lot of them have the ability not only to change the color of their skin to camouflage themselves, but even the texture, so that when they come up against like some coral, you cannot see that there is a creature there. And so making these little men or women who can, if they walk up against the tree trunk, they can just disappear. And then one of the things they can do with their skin is also flash light. And doing that in patterns and with colors and in different timings would allow them to communicate with one another.
Okay.
So they may never speak aloud because they just know what each other's thinking.
Why would they?
Yeah, why would they have
an inferior form of communication?
Yeah, well, except for they have to be looking at one another to be able to communicate.
True.
But they
Unless they have like dragonfly eyes or something.
See, I was imagining more like the lemur eyes.
Oh yeah, just
big ones.
Yeah,
just huge eyes because they want to. That's very important to them to be able to see, not only to communicate with each other, but to gather information about their environment so they can better mimic it. So you could see gnomes that literally, you could look into a forest and there might be hundreds of them out there, and you wouldn't see a single one. That's creepy.
That is really eerie.
And that means they're a prey species. If they're so worked up with camouflaging themselves, they're definitely avoiding some sort of predator. Although they might also be ambush hunting prey, which is cool.
Could be both. They don't necessarily have to be the top of their.
No. I think they're ambush hunters.
Okay.
Because that's fun.
Yeah.
I still like your idea of having there's multiple different sizes of them doing various different tasks. But you can imagine like a deer running through the forest and it stops for a second and then just it's like out of nowhere it's surrounded by hundreds of gnomes that leap on it all at once. That's great. So yeah, a creature like that has no reason to speak. Oh man, imagine one of those trying to interact with a dwarf, one of our dwarves.
Interesting.
Where I guess we never did figure out how to communicate with dwarves, but like a gnome would have extra hard time.
Yeah.
That's cool. See, that's another race that I am totally not interested in normally, but this version of it's really cool.
Yeah.
I also like the idea that they have no trouble seeing each other. Like they're so good at differentiating things that because that's what they do all the time.
Sure.
That they could look out and it's like, no, they're going to be incredibly perceptive people.
Okay.
I don't know where that takes us, but it's a very interesting knock-on effect of their nature. They also wouldn't ever wear clothes.
Why would they need to?
They wouldn't. Well, it would be counterproductive.
Would they want to?
Yeah, it would be counterproductive. They would just make themselves look like the world they want. So if you have the non-feral, the tame gnomes, the ones who aren't out in the forest, naked, pressed against the tree, waiting for a deer to come by, the ones that have managed to make it to civilization, they might have sort of adopted clothing. But it's really just them. Like they make themselves look like they're wearing something.
Oh, yeah.
Or give themselves a pattern that's distinctive. Oh, that's kind of cool. The idea that they, one gnome to a next is almost impossible for other species to identify because they're going to look different from moment to moment. So each of them adopts something as a signal.
Like a tick or of some sort.
Or I was thinking just like it might have a pattern on its chest. Like, okay, that one has 4 red dots. That's Jerry. I know that's Jerry. But that means that like other gnomes could totally impersonate Jerry. If it's an approximately right-sized gnome and he put the 5 dots on his chest, no other human's ever going to know. And they might not even care. Like you might have a population of these living in a city. They might have only constructed a dozen outside personas to interact with the outside world, and they just adopt them as needed.
Well, if you go back to the idea of them only having like a single queen or something, and now it's a hive species, individualism becomes much less important.
Exactly. And they don't, it wouldn't even occur to them to not do that. Like, okay, well, I'm just a drone, and these guys really want to talk to Jerry, so I'll be Jerry. And I know what Jerry would say, because we're all the same guy. Like, we're all... Yeah. That's cool. They might share their information freely between themselves, and like, you're going to interact with one of them. That basically means you're interacting with the entire colony.
Sure.
I like the idea also of them, if you have one colony of them in a town or a village or city or something like that, they're fine. Any gnome that you see might be from that colony. If another one moves in, like they have to have a war about it. Like they're incredibly territorial.
Ooh, I like that.
Especially in a civilized world, you can't abide other gnomes in the area because that's going to confuse all of the non-gnome people about who's who. And I also just like the idea of them being really territorial. That just sounds like fun. And then like a gnome war could be going on in the city at that time and you'd never know because it's all hidden.
And I also like the idea of with gnomes being able to impersonate each other, you end up with gnomes doing war by cat's paws where they offend other species.
Oh, false flag operation and all that?
Yeah.
A war of subterfuge is exactly how they do it.
Yeah.
And that makes gnomes like the perfect spy. Like if you are the kingdom of, or if you're the king of a kingdom and you need an intelligence service, you just get yourself a big gnome colony.
Okay.
And that's your intelligence service. Like they're really good at it. That is like, it's like trivially easy for them to like lie and trick and hide from humans. So you get them on your side and they'll just know everything that goes on in your kingdom.
So, but if they don't speak, communicating that becomes tricky.
Yeah, I think they have to come up with some sort of written language or maybe semaphore.
There you go.
Like if you send your little messages out with your little flags and you just see the responses from them.
With a light-based communication, like Morse code or something binary immediately springs to mind.
Oh yeah, binary is good. Morse code, absolutely. Something along those lines where it's timed flashes. And they might have one language for communicating with non-gnomes and then the more naturalistic language they use to communicate with each other, which is faster and more efficient.
Sure.
And for them, it feels like when they're talking to humans, it feels like, it's like, oh God, I have to...
Back to my 56K modem.
I love it. Okay, so I think we have made sufficiently bizarre...
Waiting for this image to develop for for hours now.
It's one line at a time?
Yeah.
That's awesome. I think we've made sufficiently alien races. I have one last topic I want to cover.
All right.
Which is, now, I don't think this appeals to most of what we've come up with because there's probably no option for this with as weird as we've created.
Sure.
But I want to talk about hybridization.
Okay.
So in a world where elves are more like what most people think of as elves, and they're not our plant-based weirdos.
Dialing things back to
a somewhat more normal. Like I kind of imagine a world where Australopithecines and Neanderthals and all the various hominid species that existed at one time continued all to evolve into modern species.
Okay.
And so you have, maybe you have something that we could call elves, and they're from I can't remember one off the top of my head. Actually, hobbits would be like Homo florensis, right?
Okay.
They joke that they're actually hobbits. They're these tiny little hominids from Java. Anyway, so the idea that all of these would have been from a common ancestor, so they're pretty close to one another. In fact, like the difference between a human and a Neanderthal, if you saw one on the street, you might not even be able to notice. But they are separate species, and when separate species hybridize between the two of them, they don't blend the way that a lot of fantasy writers make them. If you get a half elf in D&D, they're like halfway between a human and an elf. They're going to be a little bit taller than an elf and a little shorter than a human, and their ears are going to be a little less pointy.
Lifespan becomes kind of an average of the two.
Exactly. You pretty much, it's the easiest thing to do is just average everything out.
Sure.
That's not the way hybridization actually works in biology.
Okay.
You get that sometimes. Hybrids of tigers will sometimes have like a muted version of their stripes. But you also get things like when you hybridize a donkey and a zebra, you get a Z-donk, and they have patches of zebra stripes. Like they get the legs of a zebra and the body of a donkey.
Okay.
And I think that's an approach, especially with fantasy species hybridization, that would be more interesting, where instead of getting a blend of the two parents, they get sort of chunks of their parents, where
Interesting.
they might have completely elf ears and they might have regular human eyes, and they might have human length legs and elf length arms, and so that the proportions are off slightly.
Interesting.
And then, especially with things like if you're going to go with orcs or something like that, where like they'll have green arms, green legs, but a pink body, or tusks on the bottom half of their jaw but not on the top half, or choose any feature and just give them all of one parent and none of the other. That you'll see that a lot.
I'm also picturing orcs with a vitiligo.
Yeah,
where you get
vitiligo. Yeah,
patches of green.
That's more interesting to me than just like, it's a perfectly blended average of the two.
Sure.
You can also hybridize, and sometimes weird happens with hybrids.
Okay. Give me an example.
Ligers. Everybody's favorite hybrid in the world is liger, which is it's the father is always first. So that would be a male tiger and a female lioness mating creates a liger. Well, as it happens, one of the genes for that restricts the growth rate for each of those species happens to not match up with the chromosomal pairs.
Okay.
So you end up with a creature that does not have a growth regulatory gene that works properly pretty much all the time. And ligers are huge. They're bigger than both tigers and lions.
Oh.
And so if that is maybe how half orcs might work, you could have, when a orc and a human mate, you might get a half orc that's bigger than orcs.
Maybe that's just what ogres are in this world.
It could be. Sometimes the reverse of that is true. In this case, I think it's Tyons tend to have a overly active growth regulating gene, and they tend to be smaller than both.
You get itty bitty tiger lions.
Pretty much, yes. You also get other knock-on effects. Like most hybrids are sterile.
Okay.
And also hybrids are just difficult to come by. If the number of times the parents mate will not necessarily result in viable offspring nearly as frequently. If you want to go this route in your fantasy world, you need to make sure that hybrids are kind of rare.
Okay.
Because that just by nature, unless you want to have fun with it and just be like, no, anything can mate with anything, and we're just going to hybridize them in a weird ass way. I'm totally with you on that one. That sounds like fun.
I'm sure there are plenty of authors that go that route as it is.
Yes, but the sterility item is, I think, important to keeping the species separate, because if they can crossbreed successfully with frequency, they're just going to become the same species. Sure. Going back to our example of Neanderthalensis and modern humanity, they hybridized pretty well. And if you are of European descent, there's a pretty good chance you got a significant amount of Neanderthal DNA floating around in your bloodstream right now.
Gotcha.
Because when the modern humans came out of Africa and met the Neanderthals in the Neander Valley, if nowhere else, they got it on. And the evidence of that is still with us. If that was the case in your fantasy world, that they can just mate and produce offspring, and those offspring can mate and produce offspring, then they're going to blend together. And one or both of them are going to go extinct as something new comes out. There are some, especially with plant species, this happens a lot, where when you hybridize something, it's better than both of the parents. Sure. And if it's viable, it'll just take over and remove the two of them. A non-plant example would be Africanized honeybees, which some South American apiarists did in the 90s, or not 90s. They did it in the early 20th century. And it turned out that Africanized honeybees were much better than American honeybees, and they just started taking over. And it was a big, man, in the 90s, I remember there was like a scare. Like everybody was watching as the bees got more and more north through Mexico, and they're like, they're going to be here next year. They're going to be here next year.
I do remember killer bees being a very big worry of mine as a child.
Yeah. Well, and that's because of hybridization. So if you want to maintain the sanctity of your various races, you need to make sure that the hybrid can't outcompete the parent races.
On the other hand, I do like the idea of a story where the looming threat is half-elves.
If you want to lean into it, that's awesome. Or even just you could literally have it where half-elves are more fit than both humans and elves, and they have decided to become their own thing and have made a nation of half-elves that are going to take over the world. That's pretty cool. You could also just make it a looming sort of societal tension that the older races who have now used to be separate and are now living kind of commingled, and they're hybridizing more and more. And so there are more half-elves, there are more half-orcs than there used to be. And now all of the old timers are getting really worried about the fact that they're actually going to be extinct.
Well, actually, like going back to the idea of like removing limiters,
Mhm.
I actually like the idea of like half elves are actually immortal. Like,
Oh yeah,
whereas elves, eventually die after, 1,000 years or something. These half elves, like, unless they are slain, they just don't die.
that's actually kind of cool. So going back to our elves,
Mhm.
you could have it where whatever mechanism exists in humans that causes them to age
Mhm.
isn't inherited,
Okay.
and then whatever part of being an elf makes you become more plant-like over time isn't inherited.
Mhm.
And those processes being absent in the child just never happens, and they just keep going. That's a badass NPC.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that character. I don't think it'd be kind of a boring NPC because they would have just seen everything and know everything.
Sure. Yeah.
Although one little niggly thing about immortals is they do tend to know more than they should. Imagine being like, you're talking to your immortal friend and you're like, oh, how was the Renaissance, buddy? And he's like, I don't know. I was in Africa then. Like that whole time, I was in Africa. I don't know what was going on in Italy at the time.
It's not omniscience, and
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily impart the burning desire to study everything.
Yeah, and I mean, realistically, they'd probably know like one famous person, maybe. Like,
Yeah.
like okay, yeah, I knew Leonardo da Vinci, but
And now he just won't shut up about how he knew him.
he's got to name drop him all the time.
Yeah. So back when I was hanging out with Leonardo da Vinci,
Oh God,
you know.
he would definitely say Leo
Oh yeah,
every time when I was hanging out with Leo.
you know.
Da Vinci.
yeah.
We never called him that because it was just Leo. He was the only one around.
Yeah, I mean, it was, hey, Leo.
Yeah, so yeah, if you're gonna do hybrids, make them weird. I think that if you just average things out, it makes things more boring over time. So take a cue from nature and make them weird.
I think that's definitely the way to go with your hybrids.
All right. Well, we've definitely taken what is normally sort of a I think more and more boring subject and given it some new life. So I think we're done. We're done.
I'm done here.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Monster Mechanics. Additional information and show notes can be found at our website, monsterpod.org. If you'd like to support us, head on over to patreon.com/monsterpod. We'd love to hear your feedback. We can be reached on Twitter at MonsterMPod, or you can email us at monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by Scott Paladin. This episode was hosted by Scott Paladin and Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas generated in this episode are released on a do what the fuck you want public license.